but we're going to actually end it up with a dozen or so solutions. I know the parliamentarian said I can't hold my 8-month-old, but I wanted to prove the 8-month-old was real. Look, there's some realities. I keep coming behind these microphones to try to explain, and I continue to be just enraged, particularly my brothers and sisters on the left, the avoidance of the math. My little boy who's 8 months old, in 25 years, according to the CBO, his taxes will have to be doubled. Corporate taxes will have to be doubled. Tariffs will have to be doubled. Everything has to double just to maintain baseline services. That's the math. How many discussions have you heard here, even today, over the last month? The reality of the math, and the math will always win. So once again, I'm going to walk through some of what's really going on. And for everyone here who says, we're going to balance in 10 years. Okay, I can do it, but you got to understand the amount of bloodletting that's required to actually make that math work. And the actual structural problem is actually not on the left, not on the right, it's demographics. Something we are terrified. And what the president did in his State of the Union speech was just unconscionable. You know, when he basically used Social Security and Medicare as props for his reelection, instead of telling the truth, in a decade, the Medicare Trust Fund is gone. In a decade, the Social Security Trust Fund is gone. Does the left plan to help us fix it? Because if they don't, they get to be responsible for doubling senior poverty in this country. It's the math. So once again, I've started with this board now for multiple years, and the new numbers are coming out, and they're actually worse. The United States functionally has $114 trillion of borrowing, and it's all, every dime of it, is Social Security and Medicare. The rest of the budget actually has a positive balance. We got old. Look, I'm a gray hair with a child. Maybe I'm pathologically optimistic. But it's hard to fix a problem when you work in a place where your brothers and sisters there will not look you in the eye and say, I understand the driver of our debt is our demographics. And we will get people, and for those of you, if this ends up on YouTube, read the comments. Look at some of about half the folks get it. About half the folks, we really it's just heartbreaking, the absurdities. Tax rich people, that takes care of it. Get rid of congressional salaries. We actually did the math. The funny thing is if you get rid of all the Senate salaries, House salaries, it's 28 minutes of borrowing. And that was last year's number. In 10 years, it's like 12 minutes of borrowing. People have no concept. You can get rid of every dime of foreign aid, and it's about 12 days of the borrowing. So let's actually start to walk through to understand structurally how much trouble we're actually in. Reducing the discretionary spending to zero. So remember, the point I'm trying to make here is you just got rid of all the military. You just got rid of the White House. You just got rid of Congress. You just got rid of the Supreme Court. You got rid of the EPA. You got rid of the IRS. You got rid of everything. All discretionary money. The only thing you're paying is Medicare, Social Security, the earned benefits, some of the Medicaid, veterans benefits, so what we call mandatory around here. When you get to about 10 years, so remember, you've just wiped out of government. All you are doing is paying the benefits. When you actually remove all the mandatory, you're still having to borrow a couple $100 billion. So when the clown show comes and says, if we just got rid of this or that, we would be fine, it's not true. Your government functionally is an insurance company with an army. an insurance company that technically is broke. So let's walk through some of the math. And I'm going to do this over and over and see maybe one of these slides will actually help sink in. And I got to throw out something else. It's just annoying. The room is empty. That's okay. People are in their offices working. We're on thousands of televisions around this place. I'm desperately hoping, I've given up on so many of my fellow members, but maybe the staff that's sitting there trying to figure out the math and the policy and what's going to go on, maybe they're listening. But this is where we're at. Remember, this was just done last week. Congressional Budget Office updated a bunch of the math. So our shortfall over the next 30 years is $21 trillion on Social Security. Now remember, Social Security still has a trust fund, but in 10 years, the trust fund is gone. And I don't think I brought the charts, but I've done it over and over and over. The average American who works their 40 quarters and those things, you get every dime you put in plus a spiff. You would have made a lot more money if you put it in the markets or other places, but remember, there was discussions to try to do that 25 years ago. The left went nuts, so it didn't happen. It's mathematically impossible to do today. But Medicare functionally has $48 trillion a shortfall because the trust fund on Medicare, which is only the Part A, the hospital, part of the doctor portion, is empty in 10 years. So when you're seeing us talk about 10-year budgets, one of the great little lies around here is we're not telling you that on the 11th year, it gets a hell of a lot worse. Because are you going to backfill Medicare? Are you going to backfill Social Security? Transportation Trust Fund, Highway Trust Fund's also gone at that time too. And then you put in these over the 30 years and now add in about another $47 trillion of interest. And you start to understand when you're seeing the new scoring looks more like if you do a 30-year math on it, and this latest CBO update, you have to do a little bit of imputing of the math. You're probably approaching about 128 trillion, not that 114 trillion on the first slide. And it's actually over the next 9 budget years. I know this one says 10. Just Medicare goes up another $1 trillion in spend. And then it really starts to take off because the trust fund's gone. So, when the president basically said, we're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare, I agree. They're earned. But where was the next sentence saying, and I plan to work with Republicans to keep them solvent, to keep them here? Instead of the clown show that's going on right now saying, well, we're not allowed to talk about it. I had protesters at my office a couple days ago saying, don't touch Social Security. Okay, if we don't touch it in now it's 9 years, 9.5 years. Are you ready for your 23% cut? Because that's what the actuaries say is coming. And then the next year, it gets bigger, and the cut gets bigger, and the cut gets bigger, and the cut gets bigger. And our back-of-the-napkin math is at that time, you functionally double senior poverty. So the clown show around here goes, you can't talk about Social Security. It's become a political issue. The president actually used it in the State of the Union. Okay. So we can I'm going to show you some of the Democrats' solutions and the absurdity of the math. I need my brothers and sisters all here, if you give a damn, put some batteries in the calculator, hire a couple competent actuaries. Actually, try something even crazier. And for anyone that's watching or listening, go grab, you got 2 different documents out there. The one is really an easy read. High school math, you'd be fine. Congressional Budget Office, about 6 weeks ago, did an update on Social Security. It's an easy read. A little harder to read, but actually much more impactful. Go actually get the copy of the Social Security Medicare Actuary Report. Or is it Medicare Social Security Actuary Report? Either way. And dig through that, and you understand the demographic curve. And I'm going to show you some demographic slides, and I promise you I'm going to upset some people, and maybe it's a little too geeky. My father used to have a saying, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution. That's absolutely wrong. We're talking trillions of dollars. We're talking millions and millions and millions of our brothers and sisters. Guess what? Solutions are complex. Is this body capable? I don't know if it is anymore. And part of the problem is we've politicized everything to the point that we are incapable of telling the truth. Because often telling the truth gets you either unelected or screws up the fundraising or other things. And I just continue to be enraged. Does my little boy, do you deserve a retirement? Does he deserve a future? Because the wheels are coming off. I just showed you a slide that said 10 years from now I can wipe out everything you think that is government. And you still have to borrow money. And no, China has actually been dialing down its bond holdings for a decade. Japan has been dialing down our bond holdings for decades. We now finance most of our borrowing ourselves, actually almost all of our borrowing ourselves. Single failed bond auction, you want to talk about hell? In future time, I'll actually walk you through scenarios of what happens when we go to sell U.S. sovereign debt and it's undersubscribed, and watch the interest rate go through the ceiling because you got to sell it. So let's actually just take a quick look just to understand the baseline structure of what's happened to Social Security. And once again, no one stole your money. That was a rhetorical thing that politicians did to sound like they cared and tough because they didn't want to tell you the actual math. And the actual math was demographics. Social Security by the numbers. 1960, I had 5 workers for every retiree, for every beneficiary. How far away is 2030? Come on, seriously. Can anyone else help me do some math here? How far away is 2030? Think of that. At the end of the decade, if you are married, you and your partner, your spouse, you got your own retiree. Does that help explain part of the math problem? Understand, in the early days, for a working male, on the very first year of Social Security, I've seen it documented that the average life expectancy was 64 years old, and you didn't get the benefit till you're 65. You see some of the design issues? And yes, there was a major update in 1983. Tip O'Neill sitting in that chair over there, Ronald Reagan in the White House. They did difficult things, they shored it up. But now we've hit the baby boom curve. We have divided government again, just like we did back in the 80s. What a magical time for us both to hold hands and save it. Because you got a math problem. You got 2 workers for every beneficiary. How much did you see the President in the State of the Union show like he gave a damn for anyone that's on Social Security? I'm not going to touch it. And then what's his next sentence that's going off the cliff? There are some very creative structural ideas, almost setting up either a sovereign wealth fund, some incentives where you actually get benefited to stay in the labor market, other things. We can save it with no one taking a cut. It's just going to require math and a lot of explaining. So let's actually walk through. Now, this is pretty much another way of saying the same slide of how many workers to a retiree. And this is for my Democrat brothers and sisters. And I know this is done as a percentage of the economy, which, believe it or not, when you actually look at the actuary reports, that's actually how we structurally look at programs like this that require trillions of dollars to finance. We actually sort of say, here's the percentage of the economy that actually goes to that benefit. Total tax revenues raised in combined federal, state, And payroll taxes approach 100% for wealthy taxpayers as a percentage of GDP. It's basically saying what would happen if we functionally took 100% of the income from the wealthy. Once again, let's try this again, because there's a couple trolls out there say, well, Bernie Sanders had this idea. Okay, he does, but if you got to read through it, the amount of all the wealth income just to shore up Social Security, and then they forget 3/4 of the borrowing is Medicare. You get 4% of GDP if you take all the taxes we're already paying and then add in functionally 100% tax on the income for the wealthy. Problem is, the spending on just Social Security and Medicare is 6%. So you still got a 2% of the entire economy as the shortfall. And how much do you think if we took every dime of the wealthy's income, what do you think the economy would look like? What would the growth be? What would the investment be? You've got to understand, I do these things, they're absurd, but the discussion around here is absurd. If we just tax the wealthy more, maybe we should. But don't think it actually fixes the problem. And here's where it gets more uncomfortable, but let's do some demographics. First point, I think our math says in like 19 and a half years, United States has more deaths than births. So in less than 20 years, the United States has more deaths than births. I need you to think through that. I need to finance programs that, remember, a Social Security actuary is modeled for 75 years. And in less than 2 decades, I've started having more deaths than births in this country. And you start to understand what they call, it's actually a demographic term, but dependency ratio. And it turns out the 3 biggest economies in the world, United States, China, Japan, and this is a little hard to read, but it's worth a concept, because I also am an outlier in my belief of what much of what China does is because this curve collapsing down here is China. It's what they call dependency ratio of the number of folks they have that will be dependent on a worker. And right now, today, they're healthier than the United States. They have more workers than dependents, but their curve falls incredibly hard. This one is the United States. We basically sort of fall and fall and fall and sort of flatline. Japan is already in just a miserable state. This is happening all around the industrialized world. We don't have enough kids. It's math, it's demographics. So are we ready to embrace some pretty radical concepts? There's some great authors out there talk about how the 70s and 80s, and maybe even through part of the 90s, the world had competition for what they call hydrocarbons, oil, natural gas. In the previous decade and right up to right now, it may be world sort of competition for rare earths because of the electrification and batteries, those things. In the next couple decades, it may be an international battle for smart people. Take a look at how many of the countries we compete with that have changed their immigration codes to actually recruit people who have skill sets. And it's not all just, PhDs of electrical engineering. It's you're a skilled carpenter, you're a skilled programmer, you're this or that. It's actually a really interesting and uncomfortable debate. But as you're going to see as we talk about these charts, I can make the numbers work. But on one hand of the ledger, we need economic growth, and we need a lot of it. Well, the way you get there is through fixing the regulatory system. The way you get there is from an economy that starts to become incredibly competitive again instead of the protection racket it's become today. You also got to fix the immigration system where you're not importing poverty, but you're importing talent so you have growth, economic growth. Because remember, the trick here is over the coming decades, I need the debt to not grow faster than the size of the economy. You need that too. We all need it, and so does my little 8-month-old. And we are going to compete against the world, because the rest of the world is also, at least the industrialized world, is facing the same demographic collapse. And now we get into the stuff that becomes really uncomfortable to talk about. And I got to find a way, but it's math and it's policy. There's something really crappy going on in our society right now. And it's uncomfortable, and almost, I may be the only idiot who's dumb enough to walk up behind these microphones and talk about it. But we got a problem. We have young males entering universities almost similar to females and then not graduating. We have, and I didn't bring all the charts, but the number of young males, particularly under 35, who just are functionally not showing up in the economy. And why this is important is I'm not talking about a few, I'm talking about millions and millions and millions. And we're actually even looking at some of these charts, and where this gets a tricky conversation is when you start to see college enrollment by gender, and then the males basically falling off the cliff here, particularly the last few years, where females graduating. Great! This is wonderful over here. This is a real societal problem. There's a cultural concept called marriageable populations. And I'll see if I can weave this in why this unified theory. If I have a young woman who's worked her heart out, she's graduated, and the pool of available spouses are people that did not graduate, we're actually seeing it what we call a marriageability gap. And we see that across the board, across ethnicities, and it's actually now it's really starting to show up in our economic data of basically slowing down our economic growth projections. So when you get someone who says, well, I can do this, I'll do a tax cut here, I'll do this here, and I'm going to get all this economic growth, I got a problem. I got a whole bunch of my society that's not entering either the workforce, they're not forming families, they're not having kids. The basic structure that builds both a society, a healthy community, but also actually builds that economic underpinning of that society. It's worth studying. It's worth digging into. We got to understand what's happened with young men, because it's such a large number now. We see it in our economic data as basically stultifying, if that's a word, the economic growth. So you have a world now where my brothers and sisters on the left, my Democrat colleagues, run around saying, well, we have this low unemployment. And then you look at the available populations that should be in the labor force, but they don't show up in the data because they're not even looking. Remember, we have fewer people today in the labor force than we did before the pandemic, by millions. And then I stand up here, just pissed off, trying to say, does anyone care about the math? Because at the end of the decade, the wheels are coming off. And they don't need to. This is just more of the same, just sort of showing that the participation of prime-age males basically continues to decline. Previous other chart actually may have done a better job of showing the cliff. So what have I tried to argue here? I have debt that is exploding, and it's substantially healthcare costs. It's substantially our demographics. We got old. So I have a seesaw here that if we could get both sides in balance, there's a way it works. But you got to, over here, I got to have growth. I got to have labor force participation. I have to have encouragement for people, whether you be older, and we incentivize you saying, hey, We're not going to take your side of the Social Security, the FICA tax if you stay in the labor force and you're 70, but you feel that you want to work. Great, we love you. Please, thank you. How do I get young males back into the labor force or get them to actually graduate college? This is important. If you're a university, please pay attention to these numbers. There's something, it's almost crisis level going on out there. The adoption of technology in regulation. Do you need buildings full of file cabinets and paper to regulate the environment, or could you actually do it through technology? I mean, you're all walking around with a supercomputer in your pocket. Stick the little sensor on it and you could do air quality monitoring. Boom. I no longer need a building to file paperwork. I always know what's going on. You can crowdsource it. There's ideas like this that both disrupt, shrink the size of government. Government is just far too massive. And you can replace much of it with technology. It's the battles I have in Ways and Means over the IRS. Do you hire an army of unionized workers, or do you use technology? If you believe there's a bunch of tax cheats out there, use technology to find it. Or do you think an army of unionized workers is a much better way to do it? That's absurd. Growth ledger. What I'm going to talk about now is some of the disruptive ideas. Maybe a number of these won't work. Maybe they're just techno-utopianism. But it's the thought process, it's the mental discipline to start thinking through the basic idea of, if I had a vibrant, competitive, disruptive economy that's actually crashing the price of healthcare over here and growing over here, I can do the math and I can show you that we can flatten out this debt bomb that's about to wipe out your retirement and my kids' future. So I want to give one that's just a simple thought experiment, except it's real. Do you remember half an hour ago, the Democrats touting in the Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to spend billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars subsidizing insulin. We're going to give the very companies that they used to come to the floor here and scream about that they were pillaging people with the cost of insulin. We're going to give that big pharma money. That's how the brain trust on the left over here works. Well, actually, right over here in Virginia, there's a co-op. Remember, most of the insulin formulas are off patent. So this group over here, and it's insurance companies, it's hospitals, it's actually, I think, a couple state Medicaid systems got together and said, screw it. We don't like the price the market's giving us. We're going to build a co-op and do it ourselves. We're going to make 8 types of generic insulin. Oh, by the way, they're doing it less than the government subsidized price the Democrats pushed through, where they're handing out billions of dollars. Why didn't they turn around and say, let's bring this to market much faster? No taxpayer money. Cheaper prices, competition. Instead, the Democrats' version was, let's just subsidize big pharma. How dare they act like they did something? They basically almost screwed up competition because they started subsidizing the very organizations they used to complain about, and then made it so competition actually had to now compete with subsidized companies. Does anyone else see the absurdity around here? If you want competition in the pharmaceutical world, get more people making them. The majority of the pharmaceuticals we all consume are off patent. There's some crazy articles out there that I saw this summer of super high-speed 3D printers that you no longer need a couple $100 million clean facility to make your generic drug. There's alternative ways to produce it. What could we do regulatory-wise, tax incentive-wise, other things here to actually say, we want everyone and their cousin making safe, affordable, competitive pharmaceuticals, if that's part of the fight that we have here saying, well, these drug prices are too high. So what are you going to do? The Democrats actually decided they're going to regulate, price cap, subsidize. As a supply-side conservative, I come back and say, screw that. Let's grab today's technology and get the competition flowing. I do not know all the details on this. I only saw part of the article this weekend. But this is the thought experiment I need from you. How many of you saw the article this weekend that Apple basically believes they've broken the code for a glucose monitor in the watch? Think about that. If you are a thinking person, if I came to you tomorrow and said, you could put something on your wrist, and maybe it's not because they're expensive, but the concept of the technology. I can have something on my wrist that knows my oxygen, knows my blood pressure, knows my heart rate, knows my temperature, and now knows my glucose. If you had all those data points, what could you run as an algorithm, and also your ability to take my data 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Could you keep me much healthier? Could you keep our brothers and sisters? Remember, diabetes is 33% of all healthcare spending. It's 31% of all Medicare spending. If it's true this technology may be coming, just thought experiment. You're all smart people. Think about it. What would happen if I could take my pre-diabetic population, even some of my diabetic population that may not now be on insulins, and said, we're going to work with you so you understand what's going on. I represent this, probably the second highest per capita population in the world with diabetes, one of my tribal communities in Arizona. Incredible people. And they're not poor. They're a gaming tribe alongside Scottsdale. They're very entrepreneurial. They've done great. The data may be the disruption in the price of health care. Why am I the first idiot to walk up to the floor and say, I saw this, we should actually investigate it, we should understand what this could mean? May have we invited the scientists in to talk to us and say, what's the future look like? What would happen if it's true? And I'm going to show another thing about a stem cell treatment that's going on from a San Diego company that believes they may have found a way. I think they've cured like 6 people of type 1 diabetes, but it's less than a year, so you don't know the efficacy. But the concept is there, and the ability to stop someone from ever screwing up their islet cells. The reason I show this stuff is instead of saying, we're just going to walk in and we're going to have to cut Medicare by trillions of dollars, how about the crazy thing of curing people and making the healthcare prices dramatically lower through technology, through disruption? You got a choice. This is just a blunt, troglodyte approach. This is actually something where the society gets healthier, more prosperous. And I'm just going to go through some of these, because some of these I've done whole presentations on the floor. When you start to actually read some of the literature, that we may be on the cusp of, I think actually there's a paper being presented in this coming week on the first data sets for a cancer vaccine. Some of the drugs that are having just incredible success in curing people. The ability to actually have that supercomputer you carry around in your pocket, basically actually help you manage your personal health. I have hypertension. I have to take a calcium inhibitor. I came here a couple weeks ago and showed once again, another thought experiment. 16% of all healthcare spending is 16% of all healthcare spending is, this is $550 billion a year, so over $500 billion a year, is calculated to be people not taking their pharmaceuticals. So you have hypertension like me, I take my calcium inhibitor, I take the 1 pill every day, and I don't stroke out. And they say 16% of healthcare spend is people choosing not to, darn it, I forgot, I didn't take the pill. Now, and I know some people can say, well, you should eat healthy, you should exercise. Trust me, I do. I haven't touched ice cream in a couple of years. I really miss it. But walk through just the concept with me. instead of your preconceived conceptions, our notions. If 16% of healthcare spend is people not taking their pharmaceuticals appropriately so they stay on their rhythm, grandma forgets to take her pill, you have, you need a statin, you forget to take it. How about a 99-cent pill cap that beeps at you when you forgot to open it up that morning? Is that 99 cents worth what it would mean to go at $550 billion? What if you could just shave off a couple points of it? $200 billion, is that worth it? These are just trying to be creative. Instead of the folks who want to run around here with a chainsaw hacking apart things, start saying maybe the idea is using technology so we're healthier. And there was another article I picked up a couple days ago just to show the revolution that's about to be here. This now has an FDA approval. It's functioning, you can blow into it from your home medicine cabinet. And guess what? It's a flu test. It's a COVID test. And there's another version coming that's actually going to be 2 or 3 other things. You can have it in your home medicine cabinet, blowing it. You don't have to go to the urgent care center. You don't have to go to the doctor's office. You don't have to go to the emergency room. You don't have to go to the hospital. The technology is the disruption. The disruption actually crashes the price. Other things, and these are uncomfortable. I had this really neat article. It's a bit geeky, but it basically talks about the ability to use an X-ray, and now with some of the predictive AI looking at it, it can actually do amazingly accurate, cheaply diagnostics on whether you're going to have a risk of a heart disease or other things. It's here. And they've gone through the efficacy trials. Do we set up the policy where we make these things reimbursable? Do we make these things so we take down the barriers? Because remember, Washington often is more like a protection racket. I've done whole presentations on this from a couple of years ago, and yes, it's actually moved forward to some of the immunotherapies for some of the types of cancers. These are coming about. And now the one that I talked about a couple of weeks ago was that possibility in regards to diabetes. And we're actually bringing a couple of their researchers here, I think sometime next month, to just talk about the mechanisms. The reason I walk through all these is the first part of this presentation is understand how devastating the debt is. And it's not pretend. You can't just say, well, we'll just pretend. We'll print $1 trillion coin and walk away from it. You got to stop the clown show. Yes, there's a whole bunch of government that we can do without. But you saw the very first couple boards that basically said 10 years from now, you can get rid of all of what you think is government. And you still got to borrow money. You got rid of all of defense. You got rid of all discretionary. And you still had to borrow money to be able to cover Medicare. And the punchline there was, it's the next year. That was all a 2033 number. The next year, 2034, Social Security Trust Fund is gone. 23% cut. Is that going to be allowed to happen, or do we have to take it out of the general fund? Next year, 2034, the Medicare Trust Fund is gone. The next year, the Transportation Highway Trust Fund is gone. The second half of this was hope. I know some of this stuff is hard to process. It's hard sometimes to think, saying, oh, I'm going to disrupt. I'm going to eventually legalize disruption. And I've used this before, but it's the easiest. How many of you went to Blockbuster Video last weekend? Come on, work with me here. How many of you went and got that little silver disc last weekend? Of course not. Schweikert, that's absurd. The fact of the matter is that technology came along, we started streaming, now you have how many choices, so you sit there because saying you got too many choices, I can't make up my mind, instead of standing in line for the disc that wasn't there, that you really wanted, that you promised your family, so you come home with some crappy one and they're all mad at you. That's not that long ago. We have these types of disruptions in our society all the time. Stop being afraid of it. And Congress, damn it, stop acting like a protection racket where you protect incumbency, not incumbent elected, incumbent bureaucracies, incumbent business models. Design the tax code, design the regulatory code. If the Democrats continue insisting that subsidize everything, fine. Design it so there's competition, not the chosen favorites that they want to hand a grant out to. And in that competition, I think actually becomes the disruption that saves us. If you have a better idea, one that makes Americans healthier, more prosperous, fixes your future retirement, fixes my little kid's future, I want to hear it. But right now, this is some of the best I have. And we have a whole portfolio of these things. I beg of this place, please, buy a calculator, work through the math, understand how devastating it is, and then just try to think of a future. Try to think of a future that actually is incredibly hopeful, incredibly optimistic. But you can't have this sort of dystopian State of the Union speech we had if you actually break it down, where they know these programs are going off the cliff. And the left cares so much more about winning the next election, so much more about winning the next election. They're not telling the truth to their own voters, let alone the people are really dependent on here. And it's a level of cruelty. It's a cruelty that might work through the next election, but it's coming. The math always wins. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman from Arizona has yielded his time.